Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a crowd. People rush past you in every direction, with purpose, with earbuds in, eyes locked on their phones. You look around and realize you don't know where you're going. But worse than that, you don't even feel like going anywhere. It's not sadness, it's not depression, it's something else. A strange silence. An absence that makes no noise, but weighs everything down. And you think to yourself, I must be lost. But what if that's not true? What if the problem isn't lack of direction? What if the problem is lack of meaning? You live in a world overflowing with information.
A world that promises you can be anything, go anywhere, do everything.
And yet, everything feels like nothing. You wake up tired, go to sleep tired, and in between, you complete tasks. You climb stairs, you reply to emails, you smile when expected, and you shut down when no one's watching. Have you ever asked yourself, why do I keep doing all this if none of it feels real? Why does my day start with obligation and end with distraction? Why do I need sound to fall asleep, a screen to eat, applause to feel alive? Maybe what you call being lost is just a polite word for a void you're terrified to face. What if your urgency isn't ambition, but a way to run? What if your I don't know what I want really means I'm afraid to want? Have you noticed that the more freedom you have, the more stuck you feel? Stuck in choices that don't make sense. Stuck in a version of yourself you can't maintain. Stuck in patterns that quietly consume you, but that you keep repeating. Who taught you to call this life? Who said working soulless jobs was normal? That feeling anxious every day is ambition? That being too busy is a status symbol? Who made you believe that peace is boring and silence is dangerous? You call it routine, but it might be anesthesia. You call it a rough patch, but it could be your entire life, being carried by a script you didn't write. And here's the brutal truth. You're not lost. You're empty, and you've been trying to fill that emptiness with everything, except what actually matters. But what matters? Where does that start? Why do so many people live this same cycle and call it normal? Why do you feel guilty for being tired, afraid to be alone, ashamed to admit you're not okay, even when everything seems fine? Maybe emptiness isn't the problem. Maybe it's the symptom of a collapse that started when you stopped listening to yourself. What if the emptiness you feel isn't a flaw, but a consequence? A consequence of being shaped by a world that never asked who you were, only what you could produce. Should childhood you were handed templates for success, for love, for happiness. You didn't build a life from your essence. You copied blueprints, so you became adaptable, functional, acceptable, but not whole. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we wear to survive society. But behind the persona lives your shadow, unexpressed pain, forgotten desires, buried truths. The more you polish the surface, the more the basement rots. And one day, the cracks appear. You achieve, you perform, you check every box, and still feel hollow. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this modern hollowing. He foresaw the rise of the last man, someone who avoids struggle, depth, meaning, someone who trades discomfort for convenience and becomes nothing in the process. You scroll, you binge, you chase, but feel less. Not because you have too little, but because you've become too distant from what's real. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived Auschwitz, said, "When life has no meaning, we numb ourselves with pleasure." That's our world, full of stimulation, starving for purpose. But here's the truth. You're not tired of life. You're tired of living a life disconnected from who you really are. The voice inside that says, "This isn't it." You've buried it under noise. And now, the emptiness is the echo of that voice. Unanswered, you were trained to win, not to feel, to build, not to listen, to pretend, not to question. But now, something in you is waking up. That means you're not broken, you're alive. In the next section, we'll uncover how this silent disconnection has shaped your reality more than you ever imagined. You wake up tired. Not physically, existentially. Your body moves, your mind functions, but your soul drags behind, silent and unseen. This is what disconnection does. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It hides inside your habits, your thoughts, your relationships. It looks like I'm just busy. It feels like I'm fine. But underneath, something's broken, and you know it. When you lose connection to your inner world, you become hyper-attached to the outer one. You start chasing validation in clicks, metrics, likes, status. You say yes when you mean no. You stay silent when your voice wants to rise. You become performative, an actor in a play you didn't audition for. And the worst part? The audience is imaginary. You're acting for people who don't even care. The void doesn't destroy you all at once. It erodes you, moment by moment, until one day you realize you haven't felt truly alive in weeks. You haven't looked someone in the eyes, really looked, in months. You haven't heard your own thoughts without distraction, in years. Neuroscience has a name for this: chronic cognitive overload. When your brain is constantly switching tasks, avoiding silence, consuming noise, it loses depth. You stop processing meaning. You start defaulting to survival. That's why your patience is thinner. Your relationships feel shallow. Your goals feel pointless the moment you reach them. You've been conditioned to seek relief, not healing. To escape, not understand. To function, not evolve. Society rewards that. The market loves a distracted mind. The algorithm thrives on your emptiness. Because the emptier you feel, the more you consume. But what happens when you stop playing? What happens when you pause and feel the weight of your own existence? That's when the real crisis begins. And it's not external, it's internal. You question your career, your relationship, your beliefs. Not because they're wrong, but because they were never truly yours. This is the consequence. You've become a stranger to yourself. You laugh at the right moments, say the right things, but when you're alone, there's silence. And in that silence, you feel fear. Not of the dark, but of the truth. The truth that maybe you've been living on autopilot, that your whole life has been a series of reactions instead of decisions. You've built comfort, but you've lost depth. You've gained control, but surrendered meaning. And now you can't heal in the same mindset that made you numb. That's where the rebellion begins. Not in noise, but in refusal. The refusal to keep living a life that doesn't feel like yours. You don't need a new job right now, or a new country, or a dopamine detox with checklists and cold showers. You need a new relationship with yourself, and that starts with one act: stopping. Stopping long enough to hear the voice beneath the noise. Stopping long enough to admit, I've been running from myself. Carl Jung believed that freedom doesn't come from light, but from wholeness, from integrating the parts of you you've exiled, your anger, your chaos, your truth. The world taught you to tame them, but they were never your enemies. They were your compass. To rebel is to feel again, to allow discomfort to teach you, to let boredom sharpen your awareness, to choose meaning over distraction even when it hurts. It's not about fixing everything. It's about facing what is. You were not born numb. You were born raw, open, and alive. But little by little, the world told you to tone it down. Be realistic. Stay in line. The rebellion says, break the line. It says, wake up earlier, not to hustle harder, but to sit in silence and remember who you are. It says, turn off the noise, not to be productive, but to hear your soul breathe again. It says, speak the truth, not for applause, but because hiding is killing you. You don't need a complete plan. You need courage, the courage to feel, to write what you really want, to end what's slowly destroying you, to begin, even if you don't know how. Nietzsche wrote, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. This is your why. Not comfort, not success, not applause, but wholeness. You are not here to be tolerated. You are here to become something real, something awake. And the first step isn't perfect, it's honest. Say it out loud, even if you whisper, this life is not enough for me, and I'm finally ready to find the one that is. That's not giving up, that's beginning. What if the pain you've carried was never meant to break you? What if it was a compass pointing you back to yourself? Here's the truth most people never hear. The emptiness wasn't your enemy. It was your invitation. You mistook the void for failure, but it was space waiting for something real to be born. You were never lost. You were just buried under noise, expectation, and fear. Beneath all of it, you've been there, waiting, watching, enduring. You called it weakness, but it was strength. Silent, patient, ancient. You survived yourself, and now you're ready to meet who you really are. The final truth is this: there's nothing out there to find. No external thing will fill the hole inside, because the answer was never outside. It was in the way you listen, the way you sit with pain instead of running from it, the way you breathe in silence instead of drowning in noise. The world taught you to run, but your soul is asking you to return, to rebuild from truth, not trend, from presence, not performance, from values, not validation. And here's the paradox. Once you stop trying to become someone, you start becoming you. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes in quiet moments, a breath without distraction, a truth spoken without fear, a day lived without pretending. That's not motivational. That's sacred. Viktor Frankl said, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. This is your challenge and your gift, not to escape your pain, but to look at it and say, I understand now. You are trying to wake me up. You are not broken. You are awakening. And this moment, this realization, is not the end. It's the start of something rare in this world. A life that's truly yours. So breathe, feel everything, and remember, you're not lost. You're not empty. You're finally here.